Hello, my friends, and welcome tonight. Thank you for joining me for this fireside, making sure that all the equipment is working. It's a pleasure to be with you tonight. I'm going to tell you right up front that I'm not sure I'll be able to make another fireside happen this next Sunday. I'll explain why in just a moment. But first of all, I need to let you know. On August the 14th, History of the Saints is sponsoring our next Knowing Joseph seminar. It's on our website, historyofthesaints.org. And that fireside, or that seminar, the featured speakers will be Heidi Tucker and Michael Wilcox, Robert Millett, and myself. The tickets are almost gone for the in-person. There are only 8 tickets left, and we still have a month to go. There are only 8 tickets left for the in-person attendance at this conference. So if you'd like to come, you better hurry. The tickets will be gone by the end, probably by the end of the night. There are 8 tickets left for the in-person event. The topic is Finding Hope in Christ, and that is tied with the prophet Joseph Smith and the restoration through Brother Millett's talk. So if you're interested in going, you better get a ticket as soon as you can. I just wanted to let you know, just in case. We'll make it available for people to watch virtually, but if you want to go in person, you'd have to hurry. Also, the reason that I may not be able to do a fireside next Sunday is that I'm going to be out on my first tour for, in a year and a half. Besides going to Wyoming, this is the first extended tour. I'll be on a church history tour starting in Boston and ending in Nauvoo for the next 2 weeks. Now, what I hope to be able to do next Sunday is to, throughout the week, put together stories from the early restoration and then sort of put all those together and somehow put them together in a single file and broadcast it to you, even though I'll be traveling next Sunday night. Broadcast it in such a way that it will be just like a live fireside, except it's a amalgamation of several stories in different places on the church history tour. It would be kind of like a way of taking you on tour with me. So that's the plan for next Sunday. Watch the Facebook page, and if you're interested, you can, well, in a way, come on tour with me, even though you're not leaving the comfort of your own home. We'll see. Just keep an eye out, and I'll let you know. Now, first story tonight. And again, as always, it is a pleasure to be with you. And hopefully these devotionals will help someone and be a source of inspiration. As always, please pray for me and pray for those watching. You never know what kind of wonderful things can happen. So to begin with, you already know this. But even in the worst of circumstances, the Lord will sometimes do wonderful things. Tender mercies of miracles of love and kindness. And this story is the title story. Sunday, October the 5th, 1856. President Brigham Young stood up in General Conference and called for the strictest attention. He then said, quote, "I will now give this people the subject and the text for the elders who may speak today and during the conference. It is this: on the 5th day of October, 1856, many of our brethren and sisters are on the plains with handcarts and probably are now several hundred miles from this place, and they must be brought here. We must send assistance to them. The text will be to get them here. That is my religion. That is the dictation of the Holy Ghost that I possess. It is to save the people. I shall call upon the bishops this day. I shall not wait until tomorrow nor the next day for 60 good mule teams and 12 or 15 wagons. I will tell you," he concluded, "that all your faith, religion, and all your profession of religion will never save one soul of you in the celestial kingdom of our God unless you carry out just such principles as I'm now teaching you. Go and bring in those people now on the plains and attend strictly to those things which we call temporal or temporal duties. Otherwise, your faith will be in vain, the preaching you have heard will be in vain to you, and you will sink to hell unless you attend to the things we tell you." End of quote. I love Brigham Young's approach. He once described it that his preaching was like raining pitchforks, tines down. Well, on the morning of October 7th, 2 days later, 50 men and 22 teams left Salt Lake headed east. Among them was James Barnett Cole. As they started over the mountains, it began to snow going up over a big mountain. On the journey, searching for the Willie Company, James experienced a most unlikely dream. He related that dream to his friend and captain, William H. Kimball. He said, "I dreamed that I saw a beautiful woman in this group. She was wearing a green veil, and she was my wife." End of quote. Brother Kimball then said, "Jimmy, you'll see no beautiful woman in a green veil in this forlorn outfit." End of quote. Well, not long after that, just over South Pass, they were met by Captain James G. Willie and Joseph B. Elder, who reported the desperate plight of the Willie Handcart Company. The next morning, the rescue wagons were on their way over Rocky Ridge to meet the Willie Handcart Company. James Cole recalled, quote, that he saw the encampment just as the sun was sinking in the west. It looked like an Eskimo village, which was fully a mile away. The snow was very deep, and the paths had been made from tent to tent, which gave the camp that appearance. It was located on the plain near the river. Soon the people caught sight of the relief train. They threw off all restraints. They shouted, they cried, they freely embraced each other, and soon their deliverers. End of quote. Well, as the brethren of the rescue party rode into the camp of the saints, William H. Kimball happened to look down among them, and to his astonishment, he saw a beautiful young woman wearing a green veil tied over the top of a fur cap to protect her face from the severity of the wind and the bitter cold. Kimball turned to James Cole, and he said, "Brother Cole, there's your dream girl." Well, James invited her to get into his wagon. It is reported that at first she would not. She did not know him. However, she must have relented, because not long after that, she got into the wagon, and subsequently, the Willie Company Journal records this: November 2nd, 1856. James Cole of Fort Supply married Lucy Ward of the 4th Handcart Company at Fort Bridger. William H. Kimball performed the ceremony. And for their honeymoon, the newlyweds met just 2 days before, spent the rest of the winter in isolation of Fort Supply, Wyoming, where James tended to Lucy's frozen feet and nursed her back to health. End of quote. Marvelous story. Under the worst of circumstances, even a pandemic, the Lord is always mindful of finding a way to bring us joy, peace, and tender mercies. Next story. The world, and I'm not being a pessimist, but the world we live in, well, it's a wilderness. It's a spiritual wilderness, is it not? It's crazy out there. And if you likened it to the 1850s, yeah, there's a lot of predators out there. They're predators on 2 legs these days rather than 4, but it's still a dangerous world. And that, especially for the children, they are the most at risk. Now, I know this is a tough question, but In this kind of a world, what kind of parents, grandparents should we be? Here's a story that might be somewhat familiar. It's been mentioned in General Conference, but I want to add some details to it that I found in the journals. July 1st, 1856, somewhere on the Overland Trail in Nebraska. About noon, as the Daniel D. MacArthur Handcart Company journeyed towards the west, six-year-old Arthur Parker was ill, running a fever. So he sat down to rest by the side of the trail and, as children are wont to do, quickly fell asleep in the tall grass. Well, the handcart company pushed right on by, unaware that he was there. That is, until the onslaught of a violent thunderstorm later that afternoon forced all the immigrants to stop and set up camp. Well, Arthur was then discovered missing, and a search was mounted that lasted all night. Meanwhile, storm, thunder, and lightning raged fearfully all night, quote unquote. The immigrants lay all night in wet clothes until morning and awoke with water running under them in streams. That following morning, 3 men, including Captain MacArthur, went back and searched again for the lost child, but he was nowhere to be found. The company remained in camp for the day, waiting and drying out. The morning of the 3rd day, July 3rd, 1856, the company had no choice. They moved on. Time was precious, food was scarce. They had to go. Robert Parker determined that he would go back for his son. He wouldn't leave without him. And his wife, whom Robert had once described as, quote, the most beautiful girl in England, pinned a bright red shawl about his shoulders. If he found him dead, the journal says, he could use this to bury him. And if he was found alive, he could use the shawl to signal them. End of quote. Well, Robert turned to the east, and Anne and their 3 remaining children picked up the handcart and resumed their journey west. The camp moved an incredible and exhausting 25 miles that day. Throughout the day, Anne kept glancing over her shoulder to see if Robert was coming. As camp was made that night, Anne would climb the highest eminence and look off into the east for a sign. Consumed by worry, Anne could not sleep. The imagination would run rampant. The danger of wolves was real. Stories of immigrants devoured by wolves that were known to all. And Indians. The threat from Indians was constant. What if Arthur had been taken by a local band of Indians? On July the 4th, the camp again moved forward. Another 22 miles, and once again, Anne passed the day vigilant and weary. July 5th, the company remained in camp. Then, Sunday morning, July the 6th, 1856, at 8:30 in the morning, Anne, looking east, saw in the rays of the rising sun the red shawl and recognized her husband's familiar gait. It is written, quote, the brave little mother sank in a pitiful heap in the sand, and for the first night in 6 nights she slept, end quote. One of the immigrants, Archer Walters, witnessed the boy's return, and he recorded, quote, great joy throughout the camp. The mother's joy I cannot describe, end quote. What had happened to Arthur? Well, he had awakened and found himself alone on the side of the road. When the storms hit, he took shelter under a tree, spending the night in the open. The wolves surrounded him and howled, but did not harm him. The next morning, the lad walked 9 miles to the home of a Dutchman, where Robert Parker later found him, and the boy was saved. I've always loved that story because of righteously stubborn parents who won't give up. And by the way, you probably already know this, but this same Robert Parker, well, he was the grandfather of Robert Leroy Parker, otherwise known as Butch Cassidy. Now, I hope you keep a journal, because it may be that someday in the future that the simplest thing you may say may cause a significant change in someone else's life, like this that happened to me. As part of my work early on, while working on the Joseph Smith Papers and the History of the Saints television series, I was in the archives, church archives in Salt Lake, with my partner, Dennis Lyman. We were searching through and filming 19th century pioneer journals. While he was doing the filming, I was more or less just aimlessly thumbing through the diary of an English convert out of Nauvoo by the name of Thomas Bullock. Now, Bullock would later be a part of the Vanguard Company that came into the Salt Lake Valley first. But for the time I was reading, he was a part of that company of Latter-day Saints ruthlessly driven out of Nauvoo in September of 1846. They were without food, shelter, and provisions. He and others were forced across the Mississippi River and took up residence in a filthy slough. Bullock records in his journal firsthand the miracle of the quail that we've heard so much about. It was there in the poor camp, and Bullock wrote it down. Well, the poor camp, these saints driven out, had no means to travel and no way to go, nowhere to go. Bullock himself had been, according to his journal, terribly ill with malaria. Rescuers finally came, sent by Brother Brigham, and loaded up many of those poor camp for their trip 71 days across Iowa to winter quarters and catch up with the main body of the saints. That's the background. Now, as they began that journey across the prairies of Iowa, I began to read in Bullock's journal, and I came to this entry, Friday, October 16th, 1846. Between 2 and 3 this morning, Sister Joan Campbell was delivered of a child which was dead. Immediately after delivery, she was seized with a chill, and in less than an hour, she was a corpse. When she was driven from Nauvoo, she was in perfect health, but living on the slough opposite, and exposure brought on chills and then shakes, which has cut her thread of life. And then Bullock said, "This is the effects of persecution by the Illinois mob." End of quote. Well, that entry really affected me. I kept reading. The next day I read in Bullock's journal that Joan Campbell was buried. And at the service afterwards, he wrote this: "About 3, Sister Campbell was laid in the grave. I read a portion of the hymns, and Father Bosley prayed. Thus have I seen the saints laid low in the wilderness, followed by one single mourner, having been banished from the land of their adoption by a brutal mob on account of her religion." End of quote. Now, I've read the stories of the saints' persecutions for decades. I've studied the concept, the doctrine of martyrs, witnesses for their faith. But it was never more real or meaningful until I read that story. These were real people, ordinary people like us. They were fathers, mothers, husbands, wives who lived, who loved, and who died tragically for their faith. I tell you, you know this, we stand on the shoulders of those who came before us. But in many families, there are martyrs to the faith that some of us are not even aware of. Joan Campbell is one of them. Her and her baby, martyrs to the cause of Christ. And lastly, I end where I started. I am grateful to Thomas Bullock for writing that down. Otherwise, I'm not sure that Joan Campbell would even be remembered today, or the details of her lonely, unknown grave even recalled. You know, you may consider it mundane in your time, but in the time of your posterity, it may be most meaningful what you wrote. And who's to say that someday in the future, someone may be quoting from your journal and establishing history. Next story. John Cooper. Now, I have talked a lot, and I do it every July. I love talking about the pioneers. It just fills my soul. We've talked a lot about their sacrifices, how hard it was, and we know it was. But this story really puts a fine point on that. John Cooper was born in Leicestershire, England, the son of James and Anne North Cooper. When John was only 2 years old, his father was killed. John's mother was unable to care for him, so she sent him to live with a wealthy uncle, a bachelor, who provided much of the world's goods and a quality education to John. His uncle also insisted that John learn a trade, so John became a skilled cobbler, a shoemaker. John was described by those who knew him as, quote, a nice-looking man with brown eyes and dark, wavy hair. He stood 5'10" tall and weighed 160 to 170 pounds. He was very athletic and took part in all kinds of sports of his day. He was one of the fastest foot racers in England, end of quote. It is even said that he won a race and was presented to Queen Victoria. Well, one day, John and some of his mates stopped to hear some street preachers. John said the words of the preachers and the songs that they were singing kept ringing in his ears, and he couldn't erase them from his mind. Well, you know the rest of the story. John joined the church, and in so doing, he was kicked out, turned out by his uncle, and disinherited. That's quite a sacrifice. From 1854 to 1856, John served as a missionary there in his native land. The details I don't know, but somewhere along the way there, he met Mary Ann Lewis. They were engaged to be married, but decided to wait until arriving in Zion to be sealed. Well, they came on to America, to Iowa City, and were assigned to travel with Ben Hodgett's wagon company in late '56. When winter snows came on the 19th of October, you know this, there were 4 companies stranded out in what would later be described as one of the worst winters in memory in Wyoming. Those companies, of course, were the Willie and Martin handcart companies and the Hodgett and Hunt wagon companies. It was decided by the leaders and rescuers that they would unload all of the personal goods in the wagons of the Hunt and Hodgett companies in order to load those wagons up with suffering saints who could no longer walk, those from the handcart companies. So the goods were offloaded and stored in Old Fort Seminole, which is right there near Devil's Gate in Wyoming. Then a meeting was called, presided over by Captain George D. Grant. And it was discussed, how would we protect these valuable goods that belong to the immigrants? 20 men were asked to remain behind through the winter and guard those goods. Among those asked was John Cooper. The minutes of that meeting show that Captain Grant said to them, quote, "It was a great trust reposed in those men appointed to remain, and he wanted them to guard and care for it more so than if it belonged to them individually. He wanted, get this, he wanted no half or chicken-hearted men to remain, but men with large souls, men of integrity, men of God who would not do a wrong thing, would not steal one from another. If any such were among them, he wanted them to be passed through the devil's gate, and he did not want any grumblers or fault finders." And then he concluded he believed the men remaining were good men and would not go to do anything wrong. In regards to their food and survival in the bitter winter, Captain Grant said, quote, that he anticipated they would have hard times, but they had no need they need have no fear of starving. Why? Because they could kill buffalo and antelope. End of quote. Well, just before Captain Grant pulled out, the man appointed to watch over the 20, to lead the 20, Daniel Webster Jones, faced all of the 20 men and said, "This is your last shot. If any of you want to go on with the company, speak now. Otherwise, we're here for the long haul." Well, now as to the food, that assessment proved overly optimistic on Captain Grant's part. Family records say that John Cooper, told his children many times how they night herded the cattle to keep the wolves from attacking them, until the danger of the wolves attacking the men became too great. So they couldn't guard the cattle. The cattle became so poor and were dying so fast that the men guarding the goods killed the cattle to save them for food. One man among them was an expert butcher, and he prepared the meat, expecting to eat only the best and keep the rest for wolf bait. But the wolves didn't get any of the offal from the cattle. The men were obliged to eat every bit of it themselves, even the hides and the hooves. They suffered with cold and hunger. They dug under the snow for onions and sagos. Their rawhides were scalded to take off the hair and cooked and eaten to keep off starvation. Continuing to quote, "They were in a starving condition, and many of them were very sick because of eating rawhides. John said that their constant prayer was that God would bless their stomachs and adapt them to the kind of food they were forced to eat. When help finally arrived, they had their saddle straps soaking, preparing to cook and eat them. The men were so thin, the men who stayed behind to guard those goods, they were so thin they could hardly walk." Get this. John Cooper went into Fort Seminole on November 2nd, weighing about 160 pounds. He came out weighing 80. Moreover, John did not arrive in the valley until June 6th, 1857. 2 days later, half the man he once was, he married Mary Ann in the endowment house. He had proven himself a man able to do hard things. And then, in so few words, but conveying so much, John later wrote, quote, "We must not expect everything to run smooth." End of quote. Very, very wise counsel indeed. Don't be a pessimist, but don't be surprised when things don't go the way you plan. All right, let's take a break for just a moment. I'm assuming everything's okay because I haven't heard from Annie, so I guess we're all right. As mentioned, I am leaving tomorrow morning on a church history tour back to New York with some friends. It's a small group, but we're going to have a lot of fun. If you're interested in one of these church history tours in 2022, contact funforlesstours.com and they can help you. That's what this tour is with Fun for Less. And as mentioned, I'm going to try to broadcast from somewhere out there next Sunday. I'll try. But if I can't put it together, it requires equipment, it requires internet, it requires somebody to Wi-Fi, somebody to run the camera, requires a lot of stuff I don't have. So we'll see what happens. So be patient with me, and I'll do the best I can. I also wanted, again, to let you know that the 2021 volume of stories, the next book that will be coming out, the one that has the year's collection of all the stories from 2020 to 2021, that book will be done and out soon. The VIPs will get it for free. And if any of the rest of you want to pick it up when it comes out, contact Glenn Rawson Stories, and you can get a copy of it. It's all the stories that were sent out and the weekly emails for the last year. And speaking of that, my dear friends, even as of this morning and this afternoon, you're still sending me stories. And that is exciting. I just got one this afternoon. I don't even remember the dear sister's name, of a miracle on Interstate 80. I can't wait to write it up and tell you about it. Really neat things happening to ordinary people like us. Thank you, thank you, thank you for sending me your inspirational stories. You feed my soul. And again, if you haven't yet signed up to be a free subscriber to pick up these stories in a weekly email, I promise you, receiving those stories weekly, that's free. That's our gift to you. If you want to be a VIP, that's a different matter. But this weekly subscription to the free stories, you can have that. Just sign up or give it to a friend. Okay. This next story, it may sound a little strange. This next story is a thank you to all of you who have reached outside of yourself to love and lift and bless others over the last year and a half. Those of you who have gone beyond, I can name names, those of you who have gone beyond your own comfort zone and dedicated your time and your talents to someone else. Cyrus Hubbard Wheelock was born 28 February 1813 in Henderson, New York, the son of Asa and Lucy Hubbard Wheelock. Cyrus was baptized a member of the church in September 1839 and shortly after called to serve as a missionary in Vermont. Cyrus distinguished himself in June 1844 for his service to the prophet Joseph Smith just before the prophet's martyrdom. Cyrus was called as a missionary to England in June 1846. While he was gone, his wife passed away. In 1854, Cyrus was called once more to serve in England, this time as a counselor to President Franklin D. Richards. In 1856, he helped President Richards prepare the immigration of some 3,000 saints to America, and then followed them to the States. He arrived in Florence, Nebraska, just in time to assist the Martin Handcart Company on their resupply and get them off on their journey across Nebraska. Then, traveling in light wagons and buggies, the returning missionaries went past all of the companies on the plains and arrived in Salt Lake City on October 4th, 1856, where they then reported to President Brigham Young that there yet remained 4 immigrant companies yet out on the plains, Well, you know the rest of the story. I talked about it earlier. On the morning of October 7th, 1856, when the first teams of wagons and men set out on the rescue, 43-year-old Cyrus Wheelock was among them. Notwithstanding being away from his large family for so long, he answered the call for volunteers and went back to rescue those he loved more than his own life. Notwithstanding the snow and extreme cold, Cyrus was among the 4 advance riders who first found the Willie Company and gave them hope and encouragement to get up and keep moving until they met the wagons. As some of the rescuers turned west to help the Willie Company on into the Salt Lake Valley, Cyrus joined others and continued on to the east in search of the Martin Company. He helped bring the Martin Handcart Company to Devil's Gate. He helped them cross the Sweetwater into Martin's Cove, where they would remain snowbound for the next 5 days. Cyrus was among those who ministered day and night to the comfort, relief, and survival of the Martin Company. Now here's an insight for you. It was the custom, even in those most trying of circumstances in Martin's Cove, for the saints to gather every morning and every night for prayer meetings. In one of those meetings, Josiah Rogerson of the Martin Company recorded the following, quote, Elder Cyrus H. Wheelock, who had just returned from a 3-year mission to the British Isles, during which period he had become greatly attached to scores in our camp and company, offered a very remarkable prayer. His heart and soul was filled with sorrow at our condition, as we had several in our camp yet that had to be, to a certain extent, they had lost their minds since the crossing of the North Platte River. At least they had become like children and impersonal. Rogerson continues, raising his hands to heaven in a very impressive and appealing manner. Wheelock's voice nearly stifled with emotion and grief. He prayed to the Father that if for any fault or weakness that he might have done or committed in his life and ministry, the progress of the members of our company that he loved dearer than his own life was impeded, that if through anything he had done or left undone, he had caused or helped to cause or bring about our present plight, that God would instantly remove him out of the way by death and let the company go on without further loss to the valleys of the mountains. It was touching and deep in its humility, and this brief digest will no doubt refresh the memories and reproduce the scene in that snowbound camp for many of our surviving comrades. End of quote. This, my dear friends, was not overblown drama on display. When the rescuers took the Martin Company out of Martin's Cove and set out for the valley, they ran into more severe storms that threatened the already suffering saints. Nathan Hunting was with Cyrus Wheelock and recorded, quote, Brother Wheelock knew that they, meaning the Martin Company, that they could not make it with the sick and weary. So he stopped and prayed, asking for help and that the course of the storm be changed. Hunting continued, no sooner were they started again than the wind blew from their backs, cutting a path clear for them, and they went easily on into Salt Lake. End of quote. I was amazed to find out that other than a couple of notes in history books, Cyrus Hubbard Wheelock has been largely forgotten by his name by most members of the church. And the heroic deeds of 1856, they're known only to a few. You may not even recognize the name Cyrus Hubbard Wheelock. But I would be willing to bet most of you will recognize a song, a hymn that he wrote while serving as a missionary in 1849. Its words live on with life and vigor. Cyrus wrote these words: "Ye elders of Israel, come join now with me, and seek out the righteous where'er they may be, in desert, on mountain, on land, or on sea, and bring them to Zion, the pure and the free. O Babylon, we bid thee farewell. We're going to the mountains of Ephraim to dwell." That's the first verse. And now if you consider all that Cyrus Wheelock gave to the prophet Joseph, to the handcart saints of 1856, this third verse has a special meaning. He wrote, "We'll go to the poor like our captain of old, and visit the weary, the hungry, and cold. We'll cheer up their hearts with the news that he bore, and point them to Zion and life evermore." End of quote. My dear friends, do we love that much? And are we so dedicated to those we serve? Some of you are. Thank you. What time is it getting to be? Okay. For any and all who have lost a loved one, especially when it seemed so untimely and unfair, please consider this story, again from the Pioneers. September the 2nd, 1847, along the Sweetwater River in Wyoming, I believe near Willow Springs, Margaret Grant, the infant daughter of Jedediah and Caroline Grant, succumbed to cholera. She was buried on the side of a rolling clay hill not far from the trail. Her mother wept as if her heart would break. Yet, notwithstanding the grief, the wagon train hitched up and moved on. With the loss of her baby, Caroline Grant grew weaker and weaker. Then, Sunday, September 26, 1847, somewhere just south of present-day Evanston, Wyoming, Caroline became critical. For the first time, there was no Sabbath singing or preaching heard in the camp. Instead, the day was passed in fasting and prayer for Caroline's recovery. Around midnight, Caroline closed her eyes and seemed to be sinking. To her husband, Jedediah, she whispered, "All is well, all is well. Please take me to the valley, Jeddy. Get Margaret, bring her to me." Brother Grant answered tenderly as he sobbed with sorrow, Yes, Caroline, I'll do my best. I'll do my best." The next morning, Jedediah Grant, true to his promise, set out for Salt Lake City with his beloved Caroline. 2 days later, he would lay her to rest in the Salt Lake Valley. The entire community grieved at her loss. Caroline Grant was only 29 years old and the first white woman buried in the Salt Lake Valley. Days later, Jedediah and a friend, Joseph Bates Noble, gathered up and moved swiftly east. They now sat close to a small fire under the night sky of Wyoming. Jedediah requested that they sing some hymns. When they finished, Jedediah sat with bowed head for some time. Then he looked up and, glowing with his former inspiration, declared in a firm voice, "Bates, God has made it plain. The joy of paradise where my wife and baby are together seems to be upon me tonight. For some wise purpose, they have been released from the earth's struggles into which you and I are plunged. They are many, many times happier than we can possibly be here." End of quote. Not long after, Jedediah and Joseph Bates Noble reached the place where Margaret was buried. Noble described as follows: "A few paces from the little grave, we stopped, hesitatingly, and stood with eyes fixed before us. Neither tried to speak. An ugly hole replaced the small mound, and so recently had the wolves departed that every sign was fresh before us. I dared not raise my eyes to look at Jedediah. From the way I felt, I could but guess his feelings. Like statues of the wilderness, we stood grown to the spot, each fully recognizing that nothing more could be done. After several minutes of silent tears, we quietly withdrew, carrying away again only that which we had brought." End of quote. A terrible, tragic story. Now, the sequel. Moving forward 9 years to November 1856, Jedediah M. Grant, 40 years old, now lay grievously ill himself. He was granted a vision. He was enabled to go to the world of spirits, into which all will one day enter. He described in great detail the paradise of God as a heavenly place, beautiful beyond all descriptions, filled with gardens and flowers and buildings more glorious than anything found in this sphere. It was a place of perfect order, light, and cleanliness, a place of peace. And while he was there, Caroline, his wife, came to him, speaking words of comfort and instruction. She was beautiful. His daughter, Margaret, she too was there. Both glorious witnesses of the terrible tragedy of the plains, was and it would be overcome in the paradise of God. And then on the night of December 1st, 1856, Jedediah M. Grant passed into the world of spirits. Now, my dear friends, death can be cruel and unfair, but for the faithful, it is only temporary. It will be made right on the other side. All is well. I want to close with this story, a personal story, if you don't mind. The plucky little ATV growled along the trail, chewing through the crusted snow. We, Dennis Lyman, myself, and President Bushman, had left the shelter of the ranch house at Martin's Cove and went deeper into the Wyoming sage. It was January. It was cold, somewhere well below freezing. We traveled over the trail in the ATV for a couple of miles. Then we parked the vehicle and walked the remaining yards to the top of the hill. We stood looking out over a beautiful cove, sheltered on 3 sides. A feeling of reverence and peace swept over the 3 of us. We were standing at the top and in the quiet of Martin's Cove, Wyoming in January. It was here that the pioneers of the Martin Handcart Company took shelter in November 56. A gentle snow fell in the muted light as we walked around this hallowed place, absorbing the tranquility and savoring the feeling. I was shown the old fallen log on which President Gordon B. Hinckley sat and wept as he looked out over the cove and contemplated its history. It was here in 1856 that Isaac Wardle sat down to die, too tired and too weak to go any further. Perceiving his dangerous plight, men in the company urged him to get up and go chop some wood. He protested, but they continued until finally Isaac got up and chopped the wood. That effort saved Isaac's life. I saw stumps there in the top of the cove that had been chopped with an axe, stumps that dated back to 1856. There are trees all around the hillsides and in the cove. In 1856, George Padley and Sarah Ann Franks were there in Martin's Cove. They had been betrothed since England and, according to the accounts, had postponed their marriage in order to be sealed by priesthood authority in Utah. They were known as the sweethearts of the Martin Company. But by the time they reached this place, the journey and the weather had so sapped their strength that both were failing. Sarah was taken into one of the sick wagons to ride. George had overexerted himself in trying to help other members of the handcart company. He had gotten wet and chilled from the winter wind. Suffering from hypothermia and pneumonia, George passed away there in the cove. Knowing what the wolves would do to George's body, Sarah asked that he be wrapped in the shawl that her mother had given her when she'd left England, and that his body be placed high up in a tree. As she departed the cove to finish the journey west, she would have looked over her shoulder and seen his body suspended in the gnarled trees. Her hopes and dreams of a life with George seemingly ended subdued. We walked out of that grove, made sacred by sacrifice. As we did, I turned and looked back over my shoulder and up into those trees. There are not words to describe the hallowed feeling I felt. It was the spirit of place. It was a place. It is a place made holy by its history, made holy by sacrifices for faith. My friends, good night, and God bless. I hope and pray that the Spirit of the Lord is with you and that you will not forget them, but rather draw strength from them.